any doubts that I would have about the theory of biological evolution would be not biblical, but rather scientific. Namely, what it imagines is fantastically improbable. Barrow and Tipler, two physicists, in their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, list 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would have ceased to be a main sequence star and incinerated the Earth. And they calculate the probability of the evolution of the human genome to be somewhere between 4 to the negative 180th power to the 110,000th power, and 4 to the negative 360th power to the 110,000th power. So if evolution did occur on this planet, it was literally a miracle, and therefore evidence for the existence of God. So I don't think this is an argument for atheism, quite the contrary. It really provides good grounds for thinking that God superintended the process of biological development.
Welcome to the Casino of Life. Who wants to spin for a chance to win?
Oh, sure. I'll give it a shot. What do I win?
Take a look at this.
Huh? How about the world's first single-cell organism? This perfectly aligned string of proteins could be yours.
Now, take a spin.
I won.
Tina, tell him how many times he needs to do that to win the prize.
250.
That's right, folks, and all in the correct order.
But that's impossible.
We've heard that before, haven't we, Richard?
Come on, Mother Nature, do your thing. You stupid machine! I hate you!
Second definition of evolution is called microevolution. Now, micro obviously means what? It means small. Microevolution is change within a kind. Okay, so think about it. It's horizontal evolution within a certain kind. It's not new structures and kinds emerging, but it's a kind that changes within itself. So we look within human beings and we see microevolution. People that are taller, smaller, we see people with different body structures, different skin color, different hair color, change within a kind. Now, the famous example Darwin gave was the Galapagos finches. He goes to Galapagos Island, and what does he notice? That there's different finches on the different islands that have different beak structure and different color. And he said there must have been an original prototype finch that adapted on the different islands and evolved. Now, he might be right about that, but it started as a finch, and how did it end? As a finch. You see, this is horizontal or microevolution within a kind. Is this controversial? No, the controversial definition is something we're going to call macroevolution. Micro, small, macro obviously means large or big. All right, now macroevolution it has two components, essentially. One is common descent. So here's a picture of it that you've probably seen before, that if you trace back all complex organisms that exist today, if you go back in time, you see this family tree. Don't I have it on the next slide? There it is. There's the only image that's in the origin of species. And if you look in the top, you see existing animal life, but if you go back in time, we all relate to a common ancestor. Now, people believed in that at least a couple thousand years before Darwin lived. But what Darwin did allegedly was offer a mechanism for how the change could take place without there being a guiding intelligence. Ancient Greeks before Christ believed in common descent. What he offered was a second piece, which is natural selection acting upon random mutation. That was the mechanism that drove all this change and explains all the complexity and diversity of life. Now, is that controversial? Absolutely.
It's tough to say because we're not dealing with a theory in any sense in which, say, a physicist would recognize the theory. We're dealing with a collection of anecdotes, a certain point of view, a series of hunches. I would say that the most outstanding, the salient points are, first of all, the fossil record, which is simply mystifying. We can't make much sense of the fossil record. It does not sustain any kind of Darwinian prediction that can be intelligently derived from Darwinian theory, and it doesn't seem to sustain anything else as far as I can see. It's a perfectly mystifying record. That's one obvious point. I'm not talking just about the Cambrian explosion, I'm talking about everything that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the fossil record.
Second one. How about one of the most famous images, which is Darwin's tree of life? What about Darwin's tree of life? Now, by the way, Darwin said, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. You realize what Darwin said? He realized the fossil record as a whole was at odds with his theory, but he thought more time would substantiate it. But in fact, it hasn't. So here's what we're going to do. This is important. We're not going to look at the fossil record like humans from apes. We're going to look at that picture of the fossil record as a whole, a macro view of all of life. Okay, does that make sense? So on this whole thing up there, humans and apes would be the small right top corner. On a macro level, what does the fossil record show? Well, you tell me, on Darwin's theory, should these major changes be at the beginning, or should they come at the end? Okay, now I'll show up the next slide here. Here's what it should look like. In the present, if we have these major phyla, if we go back in time, what should we find? We should find a common ancestor, click one there for me, and then a common ancestor between those, and then a common ancestor between those, and then a common ancestor going all the way back to the beginning. So on Darwin's theory, major changes show up at the end. So at the beginning, you should have simplicity and you should have similarity. And as things work their way up the chain, then you see divergence start to emerge. Does that make sense? So similarity at the beginning, difference at the end. So all these phyla should show up after hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Do you know as a whole what the fossil record actually looks like? It looks like this. It looks like that. Do you know what that means? That means at the bottom there's this period called the Cambrian explosion, which means during this period, and we'll just assume old dating is correct for the sake of analysis. I'm not saying it's true or false. We'll just say, fine, you can have your old dating, now let's analyze it. They would say for hundreds of millions of years, there were simple organisms, and then bam, within a short period of time, geologically speaking, almost all the major phyla just appear in the fossil record without any earlier precursors. Do you see how big of a problem this is for Darwin's theory? This is huge. So click to the next slide, and you can just see visually, Darwin's theory would posit it would look like that with the web together. The reality is the exact opposite. And he points something out. He says, when you look at the fossil record, you have this sudden appearance of certain animal forms. There's not this slow emergence, it's sudden like they're placed there. Second, he said, there's the absence of transitional fossils. Between the major phyla, there's an absence. Third, he says, there's startling array of novel body plans. There's all these radically different structures that just exist. And last, he said, a pattern in which radical differences arise and then smaller scale variations later. In other words, on Darwin's theory, you should have similarity and then differences later. At this one, there's differences right at the beginning. This is a huge problem, a significant problem for Darwin's theory.
And finally, there's the utter absence of laboratory evidence. I mean, random variation, natural selection, we should be able to start manipulating organisms. When we look at dogs, no matter how far back we go, it's dogs. When we look at bacteria, no matter what we do, they stay bugs. They don't change in their fundamental nature. There seems to be some sort of an inherent species limitation, and we have no good explanation for this in terms of a Darwinian theory. We should have far more flexibility, far more plasticity under laboratory conditions than we actually do if Darwinian theory or anything like that were correct. What we see in nature, what we see in the laboratory, is very highly bounded variation, cyclic variation, as for example finch beaks in the Galapagos Island. That's about all we see. Small variations. Why is that if Darwinian theory is correct? These are evidentiary points that I think need to be stressed, need to be examined openly, honestly. And they never are, of course. Never are.
If the evidence is so compelling for evolution, why doesn't the world know?
So actually, Scripture gives us a hint. Chapter 1 of Romans says that unrighteous men suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And so actually, it shouldn't be surprising for Christians to see that important truths, truths that point to Christ instead of to Darwin, would be suppressed in this world. And so what you'll find is that anything that supports, anyone who voices support for evolution, their message will be in the mass media, it'll be received sympathetically within classrooms and within academic institutions. And any evidence that that undermines evolutionary claims basically is ignored. And so you actually have to dig for the evidence. The evidence is there, it's in the scientific journals, but it's not proclaimed. So the evidence is really, really exciting, especially in my field, genetics. Just layer upon layer upon layer of evidence pointing away from evolution. It's very, very clear the genome is designed, and it's very clear that it's degenerating. And so you just have to add 2 + 2 to realize that requires a creator.
So some of the authors do get more explicit about the rate of degeneration. There was a very major paper published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, by a very prestigious population geneticist. And that population geneticist said, well, we're definitely degenerating. His calculations were we're degenerating at 1 to 5% per generation. That's really fast. If your bank account was shrinking that fast per year, you'd be really worried. But he went on to say if the mutation rate is higher, and I think his mutation rate estimates were low, but he said if they're higher, and he's obviously thinking maybe he's low too because he put this in his paper, if the mutations are higher, we might be degenerating at 10% per generation. That's catastrophic. That means, do the numbers, you realize wherever you're starting from, you don't take too many generations before you face some type of population collapse. So I would say that genetic degeneration is a huge problem. In fact, this same author said he feels in the next few hundred years we will see significant impairment of human physiological and neurological functionality. Since the trajectory is downward, and actually when we do our numerical simulations, it shows a rapid decline in fitness for any population that has mutation rates like this, we are clearly headed for extinction regardless of how much natural selection we apply. That is, even if we had a Hitler-type government and they would ruthlessly destroy the people they thought were inferior, you can't get rid of the mutations as fast as they're flooding in, and even the best people are still more mutant than their parents, and so this process is irrevocable. You can't reverse it. And so people ask me, well, how long before we go extinct? I will not go on the line and make guesses, but I believe that Christ will come before we go extinct, so it doesn't matter. But it is very disturbing.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop one, I think?
And that's what you'll see coming up called the millerurey experiment. Now, the millerurey experiment, throw up the next slide there for me. This is a picture. If you ever took biology or chemistry, you've probably seen something like this in your textbooks. It was Miller and Urey in 1953 were trying to explain how the first life could come from non-life. So they took the chemicals and gases they thought were on the early Earth, zapped them with lightning, passed them through a beaker, and at the end collected the sample of it. You know what they found? Amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. This was heralded as a major scientific breakthrough. In fact, Carl Sagan said, quote, "This is the single most significant step in convincing many scientists that life is likely to be abundant in the universe." In fact, it was this very experiment that convinced one of the leading Christian apologists today, when in high school, to abandon his faith and become an atheist. Isn't that amazing how a science experiment can have such implications in somebody's life? So ironically, this experiment, one of my first challenges to it is the experiment itself was actually designed. There's the fingerprints of intelligence all over this experiment, and yet in nature there can't be any information input at all if there's no God. My second problem with this is that old Disney movie, I forgot what it's called, where he's singing songs and years ago. Oh, Fantasia, right? You know Fantasia? Remember when, none of you are shaking your head. I'm not that old. Okay. He goes in a volcano and Mickey like zaps the volcano stuff and life comes out of it. You remember this scene? The idea is that there was this warm puddle of just these chemicals and life emerges from it. That's what Darwin thought. There's not a shred of evidence for this prebiotic soup at all. There's no evidence it even existed. Third problem is what Lee Strobel pointed out in that video, is we now know they used the wrong gases in that experiment. If you use the right gases, you don't get life. But fourth, and I think most significantly, is that, can anyone tell me what's the simplest form of life? It's a cell. That's right, someone got it. The simplest form of life is a cell. An amino acid isn't close to a cell. Lee Strobel said it's like a brick to a skyscraper. I think he underestimated it. It's like a brick to the entire city of Chicago. What does it take to go from a brick to a city? Information and intelligence to arrange it in a certain way. If you take out God, there's no information or intelligence to guide the process. That's why 40 years after this first experiment, even Miller himself said, the problem of the origin of life has turned out to be much more difficult than I and most other people envisioned. Massimo Pigliucci, an outspoken atheist biologist, said, unfortunately, Miller-type experiments have not progressed much further than their original prototype, leaving us with a sour aftertaste from the primordial soup. And yet, as you'll see in the next picture, it shows up in textbooks over and over again. With only one side, it says, this and other experiments suggested how simple compounds on Earth could have combined to form the organic compounds needed for life. Look, does the evidence for evolution seem fact, fact, fact when both sides are considered? I don't think so. Let's look at something called homology. Every single biology textbook I've seen has this image, and you probably recognize it. You guys remember from biology textbook an image? How many of you actually remember that? Let me see your hands. A structure kind of like that. Okay, quite a few of you do. Good. The idea is if you take a bat's wing, or you take like a porpoise's flipper, a horse's leg, and a human arm, is that there's these similar structures across different organisms. So because there's similar structures in something that swims, runs, walks, and flies, they must trace back, as the next slide shows, to a common ancestor in the past. So that common ancestor had that structure, and then it adapted to air and to land and to water. It was changed and then found in different organisms, okay? It's called homology. Now, right away, when you see that picture on the top, you should be suspicious of this. I teach my students, I say, anytime you see a picture doctored, you ask yourself why it's been doctored. What have they done to this picture? The color, right? If the color wasn't kind of manipulated between all four, would you see the structural similarity that's there? I don't know that you would. They've also changed the size, right? I mean, a bat's wing compared to a horse's leg, not even close. It's been changed to draw our attention to certain similarities that may or may not actually be there. Now, I'm going to ask you something. I want you to think before you answer. And just kind of rhetorical question. If Darwin's theory were true, would we expect to see homology in nature? In other words, if Darwin was right, would we expect to see similar structures across different organisms? Of course we would. But here's the next question. Can you think of any other equally legitimate explanation for why we see similar structures across different organisms? What does this tell us? That a mere succession of forms could be the result of Darwin's theory. It could also be the result of intelligent design. But just looking at the evidence doesn't tell us one way or the other. Look, I like Apple stuff. I have an Apple phone. It's still a 4S. I'm going to get the new one when it comes out. And I got an iPad. Are there similarities in the design between a mini iPad and between an iPhone? There's similar material. There's similar shape. There's similar features. Why? Because they have a common designer. Smart designers, when they find a pattern that works, they use it over and over again. So I tell my skeptical friends, I say homology is consistent with Darwinism. It's also consistent with intelligent design, so you can't use it as evidence for evolution any more than you can use it as evidence for intelligent design. Does that make sense? And yet over and over again, it shows up in textbooks. So here's an example. 2009, you can see the picture of it on the bottom. It says, also providing evidence for evolution. Anatomical similarities between many species give signs of common descent. Do you think it shows the other side? No, it only shows one side. But now that you see the other side, does evolution sound like fact, fact, fact to you? Probably not. Let's look at the next one. Click to the next slide here for me. The last one we'll look at is something called Haeckel's embryos. Click to the next slide here for me. You might recognize something that Darwin said. He said the embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but when fully developed, become widely dissimilar. This is by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of my theory. Now, what was he saying? Remember, what did he say about the fossil record? That it was lacking and contradicted his view. Darwin said this was the most powerful piece of evidence for his theory. Now, he pointed to a scientist contemporary of his by the name of Ernst Haeckel, who made these drawings. Now, the point of these drawings is if you look closely, you'll notice like there's a human and a pig and a rat and a turtle and a fish. And the amazing thing is when you look at the top, which he said was the beginning stages of the embryo, look how similar these embryos are. In the middle, they start to diverge a little bit, and at the end, they completely change. So what Haeckel said and Darwin used is he said, in embryological development, we see similarity, slight change, and complete change, which mirrors the larger evolutionary pattern throughout the history of the world. From similarity to difference, from simplicity to complexity. He said the evidence from this is the most powerful evidence for his theory. There's one problem with this, and it's significant. I'm guessing maybe some of you know it. The drawings were faked. Flat out faked. In fact, if you look at the top, that's how Haeckel drew them. In the middle is what they actually look like at that stage of development. You know what he did? He took a cookie cutter and then he just tweaked it a little bit to make them look similar. So rather than going to organisms and trying to accurately represent them, he had his idea he wanted to be accurately represented, and he drew them according to his theory. Now we can sit here and say, shame on him, how dare he do that? But don't we Christians kind of do this sometimes with the Bible? We have something we want to prove, so we go find a verse to support it instead of go see what the verse actually says. I've been guilty of that. It's something about human nature, right? But this is important stuff. So he misrepresented and faked the drawings. In fact, the other thing he did is he cherry-picked. So rather than just taking random species within nature, he picked those that looked most similar to support his theory. So it actually looks like this. So what Haeckel said was the beginning stage is really a midpoint stage. So according to Haeckel's theories, things should start and go out like a V, similarity and change over time. The reality shows is it's more like an hourglass, difference, slight similarity, and then complete change at the end. The opposite of what he said it would say. Now I want to read a quote for you very quickly, which is very important. British embryologist Michael Richardson, note the year, 1997 in Science, a major publication. He said, it looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. 1997. It still shows up to this day in many textbooks. Here's a couple examples. Here's one from 2008. You see the embryos on the bottom? He says specifically, in the early stages of development, chickens, turtles, and rats look similar, providing evidence that they shared a common ancestry. It could say, providing evidence they share a common designer. Exactly. Look at another one, even more recent, 2011. Now look at those drawings. Those are actually Haeckel's drawings in 2011, and they're faked. Now, there's a lady by the name of Eugenie Scott for the National Center of Science Education, and her organization exists that anytime there's a debate publicly and they want to get creationism or intelligent design in schools, they get their money, their lawyers, they go in to shut it down. She's interviewed in the DVD called Icons of Evolution about why, if this is fake, they keep showing up in textbooks. Her answer was this. She said, well, the drawings are cheap and easily available. Second, we know Haeckel's embryos is false, but it teaches a principle that's true. Now that's crazy, isn't it? Could you get away with that with anything else? Well, here's a fake example of George Washington, but we know that it was really true. No way. Only in this issue can somebody get away with it. Look, this is 4 quick examples. There's so many more we could get at. But does evolution, when you see both sides and the cross-examination begins, is it as strong as gravity? Is it as strong as the Holocaust? Are you stupid, ignorant, insane, and wicked for doubting it? Is it fact, fact, fact? It sure doesn't seem that way to me.